From LPM,
Louisville Public Media.
Welcome to On Track. I'm Aisha Jaffer. Today, we're raising a glass to Kentucky's most iconic export, bourbon. It's more than a spirit. It's a symbol of tradition, craftsmanship, and cultural pride. But even bourbon isn't immune to the modern challenges of global trade disputes, shifting consumer habits, and questions about where the industry is headed next. So what's aging in the barrel for the better or worse? Joining us today is Maggie Kimberl, content editor of American Whiskey Magazine and co-chair of the World Whiskies Awards. She's a lifelong Louisvillian who was awarded the honorary title of Kentucky Colonel and recently named Spirits Writer of the Year by the Bourbon Women Association. Maggie, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, Maggie, you cover both whiskey and bourbon in your work, so this might be like a 101 question for those listening, but just in case, and for me, what really is the difference between these two liquors?
I love this question. So the easy way to explain this is all bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon. And so what that means is there are a few caveats. Bourbon has to be a minimum of 51% corn. It has to be distilled no higher than 160 proof, barreled no higher than 125 proof, and it can have nothing but pure water added to adjust for the proof. And depending on the other modifiers on that label, there could be some other guidelines there, but that's basically what bourbon whiskey is. All whiskey is distilled from grain, and then there are always these modifiers, whether it's straight or whether it's a straight an American single malt, a straight wheat whiskey or whatever, and that gives you clues as to what is actually in that bottle.
And does the aging process have anything to do with the distinction, or not so much?
Absolutely, and that's always a great question to get as well. So bourbon does not actually have a minimum age statement. That's something that confuses a lot of people. Straight bourbon has to be aged a minimum of 2 years, and bottled in bond bourbon has to be aged a minimum of 4 years. But outside of that, there's really not a requirement other than that it has to be placed in a charred new oak container. So Jimmy Russell will famously say you can take a new charred oak bucket over to where the high wines are coming off of the still, fill it up, and then walk that bucket over to the bottling line and bottle that, and that is considered bourbon. It's just not straight bourbon because it has only been aged a few minutes.
And I love that smell, the barrel. And
absolutely.
Everything,
it's lovely, isn't it?
Which obviously reflects in the whiskey themselves and then creates these amazing, I think someone had asked me to try to say the notes, and it's always something like a leather satchel on the back of a bike. Smells like that, tastes like that.
Well, I actually teach people how to taste whiskey. And I tell people, if you get something that somebody else is not getting, or if you don't get what they're getting, that's not wrong. Everybody's palate is different. Everybody has different sensory memories. And so you have to be able to access those sensory memories that you have. So if somebody says marzipan and you don't know what marzipan is, it's almond paste. If you taste almonds, then you guys are getting the same thing.
Oh, that's really cool. I love the memory aspect of it. And that makes it so inclusive as well. Because it's everybody's answer is correct.
There are no wrong answers. And that's kind of why I ended up in this industry, because it is a very blue-collar, welcoming industry.
That's awesome. So, okay, we were talking about whiskey and bourbon. Do whiskey and bourbon occupy different spaces in Kentucky's identity, or because they're so closely tied, do most people treat them as the same thing?
Well, so bourbon is bourbon, and bourbon is also whiskey, right? So it's kind of who you ask, right?
Yeah.
It is the same thing. And all the distilleries in Kentucky, for the most part, are making other styles of whiskey as well. Bourbon is popular because bourbon survived a lot of, we like to say assassination attempts. Things like, rectifiers who were putting bad things in there in the 1800s, Prohibition in the early 1900s, the war effort that caused all of them to have to stop producing bourbon to make ethanol for the war effort for things like artillery. And, then there was just a cultural downturn where the younger generation didn't want to drink that anymore. And now we've got this new unfortunate assassination attempt taking place.
Yeah, and we'll dive deeper in there. But I want to ask, because I'm not sure if everyone knows this, 95% of the world's bourbon is made right here in Kentucky. And I've heard the joke because you talked about the process, right? That there's something in the water here. But is there actually some truth to that? Like, what makes Kentucky so uniquely suited to bourbon production?
It's really kind of a perfect storm. I like to tell people that bourbon did not come about because a bunch of people were sitting in a room saying, hey, we're going to make this stuff and we're going to call it bourbon, and it's going to be made from corn, and we're going to put it in a barrel, and it's going to use this water. It was really just one serendipitous moment after another, and one I guess you would say improvement after another. So it started off that people came here, they brought their distilling equipment because that was just part of farm life, being able to preserve your harvest and turn it into something that was marketable, saleable, that sort of thing. And so, they came here and they started farming. And what grows here? Corn. Again, Jimmy Russell likes to tell people if rice had been the thing that grew here, bourbon would be made from rice. It wasn't like somebody decided we're going to grow corn here because we want to make bourbon. And so it was just, the water is great here because we have such a thick and substantial limestone shelf. That's also what causes the bluegrass to be blue, is that limestone. It's easily dissolvable. It adds a bunch of minerals to the water. It takes out iron. Iron makes bad whiskey, so it filters out that iron. It adds those minerals, the calcium and other nutrients, and yeast love to eat those. So, it's kind of just a serendipitous thing that corn grew here. The water was good. People brought their stills. They knew what to do with it. And then somewhere along the line, there was the earliest mention that we have of aging this whiskey in a charred barrel is a grocer named Catherine Carpenter. She wrote a letter to a distiller and said, hey, what if we char these barrels so that this bourbon this whiskey stuff, this bourbon stuff can actually compete with that French brandy that everybody's drinking down on Bourbon Street. And so that is really the genesis of the idea of using a charred barrel was, it'll make it taste better. Let's try it. So that's really where all these things came from. And the fact that Kentucky survived Prohibition, these multiple assassination attempts, really has a lot to do with organizations like the Kentucky Distillers Association, because a lot of these distillers have worked together for, mutually beneficial outcomes for generations.
That's incredible. And it's cool to hear about a woman in history in
Absolutely.
bourbon. And I do want to get into that because you were also recently named Spirits Writer of the Year by the Bourbon Women Association. So what has the journey been like for women in bourbon, in the bourbon world, both historically, as we're talking about, and in your own experience today?
Well, I want to tip my hat to Fred Minnick, who wrote the story about whiskey women. That's a great book if anybody has had a chance to read that. And, really that came about because Fred Minnick was talking to Peggy Noe Stevens, who is a friend of mine, and who is the founder of the Bourbon Women Association, who was also the first woman master taster in the Kentucky bourbon industry. And so, Peggy said to Fred, women were the original brewers and distillers, and Fred didn't necessarily believe that right offhand until he started doing the research and he kept finding all of these stories. And so I like to remind people that the history that we have, history is always written by the victors, right? That's the saying. And the history that we have is based on, whoever was owning that brand at the time, whoever was in charge of that brand at the time. They weren't necessarily highlighting the work of the people, like the actual distiller, the actual warehouseman, and that sort of thing, even though those are all integral parts. So throughout history, you see, there's another great book, Mallory O'Meara wrote this book called Girly Drinks, and I almost didn't read it because I hated the title and the cover was pink. And I'm glad that I stuck it out because really she paints this picture of, the first, the Olympic still was invented by a Jewish woman in Alexandria around the 3rd century, I think. And, all these advancements that have taken place in brewing and distilling and, other fermentation sciences, that was always a matter of home and hearth. So women have always been the ones doing this. And then when it came time to turn that into a business, then the men said, oh, well, we'll take it from here. So that's why we know more about the men who worked in these industries than the women, even though the women have absolutely always been there. There's always a story of a woman. Margie Samuels is a great example of a woman who, the Samuels started Maker's Mark at a time when bourbon was not terribly popular, and they just wanted to make something that was really good, really high quality. And Margie Samuels really led the charge for all of the branding that built this brand that we all know and love today. So, yes, women have always been there. Women have been contributing since the dawn of time in this, and in what has led to this industry.
That's just incredible to know. So a lot of key women, and it sounds like a lot of key women too in this region, obviously, where 95% of bourbon is made. But I love to hear these kind of untold stories. And I've also seen, because I've gone to a couples tours as a somewhat new person in town, and I've seen women being the master tasters as well.
Absolutely. And, women have better tasting skills generally as a whole than men for a couple of different reasons. And this is a story that I did several years ago for Whiskey Magazine. Women have larger olfactory bulbs, number one. And the genetic reason for that is being able to sniff out a partner who is going to give you successful offspring. And so that's one of the evolutionary pieces of that. The other thing is women have faster and more accurate brain to palate recall for those sensory memories that are so important. So women can taste a wider range, and we can also recall a wider range. And that's why there are so many amazing women master tasters in this industry.
That is so cool to hear about. Well, you're traveling quite a bit in this industry, and you were recently at George Washington's Mount Vernon Distillery as a volunteer, and then at the New Orleans Bourbon Festival teaching a seminar. Can you talk about like a day in the life, or maybe a week in the life as a bourbon aficionado?
Oh, so, a week in the life, it varies so widely. There was a period last year, a 9-week period, when I was in 16 different cities across the United States. So I not only cover the Kentucky bourbon industry, I cover the entire United States, all of the distilled spirits in the United States. And there's a lot of really amazing stuff going on. And so one week I might be actually making whiskey at Mount Vernon. The next week I might be teaching classes about, one of the classes that I taught last week at the New Orleans Bourbon Festival was biodiversity in whiskey's grains and why that matters. And so we're seeing a lot of especially the smaller distilleries really embrace non-standard varietals of grain. So as opposed to common rye, common wheat, common yellow dent corn that you can get on the commodity market, they're looking at heirlooms or hybrids of multiple heirlooms of different grains, and it produces a totally different flavor. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on out there.
Well, that's so fascinating, and I bet there's a bunch of jealous people listening right now. Well, we'll be back in just a minute. You're on track with Louisville Public Media. You're on track. I'm Aisha Jaffer, and we are talking to Maggie Kimberl, content editor of American Whiskey Magazine and co-chair of the World Whiskies Awards, about whiskey, bourbon, and the current state of Louisville's bourbon industry. So there have been a lot of recent challenges for the bourbon industry, especially with ongoing trade tensions and tariffs. How are Kentucky distilleries, particularly the small ones, navigating all this uncertainty?
Well, I think the small ones are actually better positioned in a lot of ways because they don't have the export. They're not reliant on the exports as much as some of the larger distilleries are. So those, I like to call them the kind of medium-sized distilleries, the ones that have a really solid regional following. They're positioned pretty well, and I'm not really hearing anything terrible going on. Certainly it's going to affect people because, obviously the supply chain is being interrupted for things like bottles, labels, things like that. But really they're so small and insulated that they're going to be a little bit better positioned than the larger players. The larger players, we've seen Brown-Forman lay off upwards of 300 people recently, shut their cooperage down. We've seen Diageo announce layoffs. They shut one of their production plants in Kentucky. And that's the kind of thing where they are responding. That's like turning around a steamship, right? I mean, it takes a long time to turn that around. So they are responding as quickly as they can. One of the unique things about this industry is you have to forecast 10, 20, 50, 100 years down the road. You can't just make this product and sell it next week. It has to be matured. You have to be able to source, and it's heavily dependent on things like the climate and any natural disasters. So, if there's a natural disaster that wipes out a large percentage of, say, a corn crop, everybody's going to feel that on down the row. So these larger distilleries do a pretty good job of forecasting what they think it's going to be in 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, 50 years down the road. And so one of the things that we've been seeing over the last decade is everybody increasing their production. And they're kind of pulling back on that now, which is a sign that maybe that growth is slowing. It's not necessarily that, things are taking a downturn, but the production has caught up to the demand at this point for most of these producers, and they're saying, okay, I think we're in a good spot. I think we need to pull back a little bit, slow down, take the foot off the gas, so to speak.
Yeah, and that's hard with unpredictability if
Sure.
you're planning so far in advance. And when you're talking about those small distilleries too, then I'm guessing like their sales more domestic because they're local? Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Generally speaking, yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are some, I've definitely talked to people. The last time around when we had the tariff talk, there was a distillery that I was talking to in Virginia, Catoctin Creek, and they were hiring somebody because they, had gotten a contract to be able to export, and they ended up having to turn around and, redirect that person and completely shut down that business. And they had already ordered bottles and labels and things for the export market, and it just kind of just shut down right away, which is, that's a hard position to be in as a smaller distiller when you try to make that leap, because that's a big leap of faith. And when you have that much money and time invested in that leap of faith that just kind of gets cut off at the knees, that can be hard for a lot of people.
Absolutely. And at the same time, we're also seeing this noticeable shift toward moderation and the rise of sober, curious movements. How do you see that trend influencing the bourbon industry?
I think that's something that comes around from time to time. Interestingly, one of the events that I was at last week in New Orleans, Bernie Lubbers, who's the whiskey professor, he's an educator for Heaven Hill. He was telling a story about their recent all-hands meeting about the economy. And Max Shapira, who is the president emeritus or something, he's retired now, but it's his family's company, read a headline of a story that said whiskey sales are slowing and the youths aren't drinking anymore. And he said, I want to remind you that this was written in 1986. So this is a cyclical thing that comes around from time to time. There are ups and downs. And right now, I think people are looking at this downward trend in sales. But when you look at, there was a really great graph in the New York Times a few weeks ago that showed the spike in sales because everybody was sitting home during the pandemic and they got a new hobby and they started making their drinks at home and everything. They started stockpiling stuff. And so there was this huge spike in whiskey sales and bourbon sales during, from 2020 to about 2023, early 2024, and then that started to really drop off. But if you look at the trend overall, the curve kind of just, it jumps a little jump, but the overall line, the overall growth is still going up. It's still where it was intended. It's where it has corrected to where it would have been had the pandemic not happened. Now it'll be interesting to see if that trend continues, but right now it looks like everything's still pretty solid as a whole for the industry.
So are other things, though, when I'm thinking about the sober curious movement and the diversifying of options like THC drinks
Sure.
and edibles, are those influencing the market at all?
I think there are a lot of people who are, giving up alcohol and going over to THC. I think they call it California sober. But I think there are always going to be people who go back and forth, and it'll be interesting to see what plays out. I don't know that anybody really has a clear picture of what that's going to look like. But for the most part, I feel like people are not super worried about that right now.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear about because, we hear all these different things, all these
Sure.
different trends influencing it. And it is such a legacy, liquor. So it's kind of wild to think about. And I was thinking about how these challenges, if they were challenges, like you sort of said this in the reverse, but the ripple effect on the broader Kentucky economy, like in areas like tourism, agriculture, or local communities. And as you mentioned, like just even on the production line of like if corn had a bad year and how
Sure.
that influences the production itself. I mean, so you haven't heard anything really on the challenges and a ripple effect there as of yet.
Well, interestingly, tourism is still so popular here. Everything's booked out pretty much 6 months in advance.
Wow.
So, we kind of reached this critical mass around, I want to say 2022, where prior to the pandemic, if you wanted to come to Kentucky and do bourbon tourism, we're talking about up to 2019 into early 2020, you just showed up and there was probably going to be a tour available. And if you didn't want to do this tour, there was that tour. Or if this was booked up, you could go across the street and there was a tour there. Now I get so many people reaching out to me saying, oh no, I wanted to do a fun weekend in Louisville and go to all these distilleries and everybody's booked. Help, what do I do? And so I'll actually, call around and say, do you have any cancellations? I'm looking for a spot for 4 people, 5 people, whatever. And so since about 2022, everything has booked up 6 months in advance. They put their tickets online, and within a few days, everything is completely booked. And distilleries are working overtime trying to increase the availability of tourism options. So Angel's Envy actually doubled the size of their visitor center to make accommodations for people who couldn't get on the tours to be able to come in and at least do a tasting. And so we're seeing a lot of that sort of thing. We're seeing a lot of these auxiliary tasting rooms opening up on Main Street in downtown Louisville on Whiskey Row. And so people are really working hard to make sure that nobody comes here and gets turned away. But that is still a thing that is happening. So from the tourism aspect, everything is looking great.
So since we're talking about bourbon, bourbon is changing and how it's accessible and how we're doing these tasting rooms, but also it's a legacy liquor. Have you noticed the identity of bourbon in Kentucky in history to now, or even in your time working with it, change over time?
That's a great question. So, you talked about that 95% figure of bourbon being from Kentucky. It can be made anywhere in the United States. Historically, bourbon has actually been made in Mexico, Canada, lots of places. And so it wasn't until 1964 a congressional resolution was passed declaring that bourbon was a distinct product of the United States. And basically, that only gets honored if our trade partners if we have those trade agreements and our trade partners honor our laws. And so one of the things that a lot of people are really concerned about right now is with the trade wars, bourbon could potentially start being made elsewhere if we no longer have those trade agreements in place with people. So that's one of the biggest existential threats to Kentucky bourbon and American bourbon is that, if we don't have those trade agreements in place, that could go away. One of the, cultural things that has changed is that for a very long time, this was seen as a blue-collar drink, a blue-collar industry. And I think there are some producers trying to fancy it up a little bit too much. And that doesn't necessarily lend itself to bringing everybody into the fold. One of the reasons why I love this industry is because it brings everybody into the fold and it's, welcoming and there's, very little pretension. So I'm seeing that kind of pretentiousness creep in, and that is of personal concern to me, but for better or worse, that's just where it's going.
Well, that returns to kind of what we were talking about earlier. Everyone's answer is correct. It's a very inclusive
Sure, exactly.
liquor in many layers. So I totally understand that. So I'm kind of curious for those who do want to get more, I guess, involved or understand more about bourbon culture in Kentucky, what would you recommend?
Well, I recommend finding a distillery, going on a tour, do a bourbon tasting, talk to people. There are so many communities out there. There are great podcasts you can listen to. Bourbon Pursuit is a great one. there are lots of opportunities for education out there in many, many different forms. There are restaurants that do, cocktail pairing dinners. You can go to a distillery and take a cocktail class. There are so many different ways to approach this. There's no limit to the opportunities that you can have for education. Absolutely.
I sort of saw your mind just go like, there's so much
I know.
there.
I'm like, I don't know how you want me to answer this. How long do we have exactly?
I know. Well, and then what's your personal hope for the future of Kentucky bourbon?
My personal hope for the future, this actually means a whole lot to me, especially this question in particular. When I graduated from high school, a lot of my friends moved away because there were not jobs here. And the bourbon industry has been the main reason why so many jobs have been able to come back to this. It's one of the top employers and revenue producers of our state now. And that means a lot to me because, I stayed and it was a struggle, finding employment and building a career and all that sort of stuff. And now I look at, where the bourbon industry has ended up, and it makes me hopeful for my children's future that if they want to stay here, there will be jobs for them. So, that's a very personal question for me because I'm a 9th generation Louisvillian. My kids are 10th generation, and my family's been here for a really long time, and I want my kids to be able to stay if that's what they want.
I love that. I love that history and you being a part of it, truly. So I know this is a little bit of a cheeky question, and you don't have to answer it because I don't know if it's going to get you in trouble if I ask you, what are some of your favorite bourbons or bourbon?
Whatever you're buying. I can't get in trouble with anybody. That's the beauty of my job. There's nobody to be in trouble with.
Because it's all good. Oh, yeah, because you've created this for yourself.
Yeah,
right?
I'm a freelancer, yes.
I love that. Well, I really appreciate your time with us and talking about, Kentucky's most iconic export. So, Maggie, thanks for being here on Track.
Thank you for having me.
Maggie Kimberl is the content editor of American Whiskey Magazine and co-chair of the World Whiskies Awards. She was awarded the honorary title of Kentucky Colonel and recently named Spirits Writer of the Year by the Bourbon Women Association. On Track is a production of Louisville Public Media. The On Track production team includes Michelle Tyreen Johnson, Jacob Munoz, Alex Biscardi, and Laura Ellis. Our music is by Kojin Tashiro. If you're just tuning in and you want to hear the full show, you can find it now at LouisvilleOnTrack.org or in your favorite podcast app. And let's continue the conversation. Is there something you want to hear about? Something that matters to your Kentuckiana experience? Let us know by sending us a text or giving us a call at 502-814-TALK or send an email to ontrack@lpm.org. I'm Aisha Jaffer, and remember, where the bourbon is bold, stories are certainly told. Until next time, you're on track with Louisville Public Media.
No offense, but your brain is a terrible place to keep your big idea. It belongs in the world, but you know that already. You have a calling, a voice that says, this is what I'm meant to do. Create the website your big idea deserves with Wix. Make it your own with top-to-bottom customization, AI to help realize your vision, and built-in business tools to turn your daydream into your dream job. Wix supports every stage of the business journey except one. Your decision to begin. Ready? Go to Wix.com.